Professor Charlotte Biltekoff is Professor of American Studies and Food Science and Technology, and Darrell Corti Endowed Professor in Food, Wine, and Culture at the University of California, Davis, where she builds bridges between scientific and cultural approaches to questions about food and health. Her expertise centers on understanding where ideas about good and bad food come from and the social and cultural role that they play. Charlotte is an author of Real Food, Real Facts, Processed Food and the Politics of Knowledge, published last year, and Eating Right in America, The Cultural Politics of Food and Health, published in 2014. She was recently a co-PI on the UC After Project, a multidisciplinary research project examining the Bay Area agri-food tech sector. And Charlotte's research is interdisciplinary, and she frequently collaborates and communicates across disciplinary differences. So again, this is going to be a very, very interesting talk. Please, if you have questions, do it as we go, do it live as the chat goes, because you might forget afterwards, and do it in the Q&A. So enough of me, over to you, Charlotte. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. It's great to be here. It's morning for me, so good morning, good evening to you. I just want to thank the conveners of this event before I get started, especially Christian and Christina for the invitation and Elaine for handling all the logistics, as well as Janaina for stepping in to chair the session at the last minute. So my talk today is about the role communication between the food industry and the public plays in shaping possibilities for food politics to take place. And by food politics, what I mean is the kind of contestation over the aims and trajectory of the food system that includes policy, as well as the expert and public discourses that shape and inform policy. And I'm especially interested in and concerned about, frankly, communication about technology in the food system. And my talk will focus on communication about processed food. I'm interested in how food industry communication about processed food can actually foreclose possibilities for food politics, or make it harder and less likely for meaningful public debate and contestation over the food system and critical food system issues to take place. So I'm also going to highlight some strategies. These are like analytical strategies or ways of thinking that I think and have found can help resist some of this anti-politics. And my research takes place in the US, but I hope wherever you are, you'll find connections and insights that are relevant to what you're thinking about. And I wanted to start actually with a story. It's the story of how I became preoccupied with this topic, communication between the food industry and the public about processed food. So I'm a food studies scholar, and I'm trained in the field of American studies. These are both interdisciplinary humanities and qualitative social sciences kind of oriented fields. They're inherently critical of all kinds of things, including capitalism and the food system and the food industry. But due to an unexpected series of events that unfolded about 20 years ago, my faculty position at UC Davis, University of California, is half in American studies, the field I'm trained in, and half in food science and technology, a field that I had frankly never heard of until I became assistant professor of food science and technology, and a field that is closely aligned with the food industry. So I live and work between two very different worlds, and I often travel between them. So for example, in February 2014, I was invited to be a lunchtime speaker at the California League of Food Processors annual Processing Expo in Sacramento. And while I was there, I went to a breakfast talk by David Schmidt, who was the president of the International Food Information Council. And IFIC, as you can see here on the slide, describes itself as a nonprofit education and consumer research organization with a mission to effectively communicate science-based information about food safety, nutrition, and sustainable food systems. In reality, IFIC is a very powerful trade association representing the food industry. Its members include the most powerful food companies in the world, such as Cargill, Coca-Cola, Danone, General Mills, Mandalay, PepsiCo, all the big ones. And IFIC is often referred to by critics as a front group because its motives are often not clear to the public. So the talk I went to that day was called Consumer Opinions About Processed Food and How the Food Industry Can Improve Communication with Consumers. So Schmidt, the president of IFIC, explained that IFIC had been conducting research on consumer perceptions of processed food since about 2008 and had found what he referred to as a pretty negative environment. Across all demographics, there were high levels of negative associations with processed food. And he was concerned that nobody seemed to be talking about the benefits of processed food. And even some IFIC members were promoting their products as natural. So, in the rest of his talk, Schmidt talked about everything IFIC was doing to counter this problem of what he called misinformation and falsehoods about the processed food industry. They published a white paper that was about the scientific basis for processing. They developed consumer friendly messaging platforms in their understanding our food communication toolkit for communicators and opinion leaders. And they put together this communicator's guide for food biotechnology. He was especially excited to share that IFIC had just established a new organization called the Alliance to Feed the Future. And the mission of the Alliance to Feed the Future was to provide balanced public dialogue about how modern agricultural technology, innovation, and food production benefit society. At the time, he said the new org already had 118 food industry members, and what it had done first was put together this K through 8 curriculum that he claimed had already reached 750,000 teachers and at least 4.5 million students. So, from my perspective, grounded in food studies, negative perceptions of processed foods express and encompass a whole range of legitimate concerns about the industrial food system. These have to do with health and safety, sustainability, technological risk, regulatory laxity, and the behavior of the food industry, and more, right? So I was fascinated and concerned also to see IFIC seem to think that public concerns about processed foods stemmed from irrational fears and from scientific ignorance, and that they could be addressed or corrected more accurately with the facts about food production and food processing. So, for example, the introduction to the Understanding Our Food Communication Toolkit explained that while many people are concerned about processing, some views result from lack of awareness about these processes and foods. And as you can see here, the goals included communicating facts about modern food information and clearing up misinformation. The Food Biotechnology Communicator's Guide described consumer opinions as based in emotion and began with a large graphic advising readers to communicate the facts clearly and concisely. In 2014, IFIC launched this FACTS network, Food Advocates Communicating Through Science. And its mission was to combat the growing tide of deceptive advice, misleading statistics, and alarmist tactics that define much of today's food and nutrition dialogue. So pretty soon I started to notice that these assumptions about the origins of consumer concerns about processed food and therefore what should be done about them were all over the place, at least when I was navigating in my food science world. So for example, I saw it all over the pages of industry magazines that I regularly received in my inbox, like this advertorial that I'm sharing with you here, advertorial meaning a combination of an ad and an editorial. From the this was from the Corn Refiners Association, makers of high fructose corn syrup. And this is about how misinformation and ignored science leads to irrational fears that can be overcome with the facts. So ultimately, I decided to try to make sense of all of this. And the result is the book, Real Food, Real Facts. The book and it is available free as an open access download, by the way. So the book focuses on how trade associations in particular have sought to improve public perceptions of processed food through science-driven communication. And I'm interested in the political stakes of these campaigns, as well as the assumptions about the public that shape them. So the title of the book refers to the way of thinking that I eventually came up with to help me make sense of this mess, right? Everything I was seeing and the confusion, frankly, that I was feeling being caught between two very different worlds when it came to processed food. So it describes this whole landscape as a framing contest, a competition over authority, credibility, and influence between different ways of seeing the same thing. So from the point of view of the real food frame, processed food is a problem for all kinds of reasons. These include its effects on individual health, its relationship to population-wide health problems, its relationship to environmental, social, economic, and other issues. It's like seen as a troubled product of a troubled food system. And so from this perspective, the solution is to avoid processed food and try to reform the food system. And the real food frame is taken up by many members of the public and their advocates, some public health experts as well. The real facts frame emerged as a response to the real food frame. And from this point of view, the problem is not with processed food itself at all. The problem is public misperceptions about processed food, which are seen as based in lack of scientific literacy. So the solution from this point of view is to educate the public so they can better understand and appreciate the benefits of processed food. And this position or point of view is taken up primarily among experts in the food industry and its allied sciences. So the focus of the book is on understanding and critiquing this real facts frame and the assumptions that drive it, as well as its side effects or unintended consequences. And a foundational strategy or a foundational move of the analysis is to contest the persistent focus of conversations about trust in the food system on public perceptions and misperceptions of science and technology. I focus instead on expert perceptions and expert misperceptions of the public. And I start by telling the story of how good food became real in the early 21st century, or where the real food frame came from. Contrary to the real facts perspective, the real food frame did not emerge from ignorance, emotion, and misperception. Since the early 20th century, legitimate concerns around food and the food system have converged around this shared, if vague, idea that good food was real and processed food was bad and should be avoided. So these converging legitimate concerns included concerns about obesity and other issues in dietary health, the concerns about environmental sustainability, and rising concerns about technological risk in general, as well as regulatory laxity in the food system, and also just concerns about industry actions and inactions related to all of these things. Um, so because of this understanding of where the real food frame comes from, I view the real food frame as a practice of politics. So this is, I'm drawing on Tanya Lee's work here, how she describes a practice of politics as an expression in word or deed of a critical challenge that often starts out as a refusal of the way things are. And my central concern and the big idea of the book and this talk is that in reframing this practice of politics as ignorance and misperception, the food industry communicators that I study enact a kind of anti-politics that works against the potential for meaningful contestation within and over the food system. So as I mentioned, I'm really interested in expert assumptions, and the real facts frame I found is fundamentally shaped by a set of assumptions that I refer to as food scientism. So challenges in the food system, as we all know, are intricately social, cultural, political, etc. But food scientism, like scientism more generally, assumes that science is or science should be the primary way of knowing about food. So it narrows the scope of the kind of questions about food that seem reasonable to ask to those that can be answered scientifically. So food scientism in this way causes experts to overlook all other concerns that people might reasonably have about the food system and its technologies. And food scientism also goes hand in hand with a deficit model of the public understanding of science. Once the terrain of reasonable discourse has been narrowed to questions that can be answered scientifically, anything outside of this comes to be seen as irrational and emotional, rooted in lack of scientific literacy, or even anti-science sentiment. And I think I kind of love this viral image of the all-natural banana and its ingredients as an illustration of food scientism. Many of you have probably seen it. It was produced by an Australian chemistry teacher named James Kennedy to educate the public about chemicals in food. So his assumption is that concerns about chemicals in food were caused by people not understanding, having irrational fears because they didn't understand that all foods were made of chemicals, right? Um, he was graphically illustrating the fact that even natural foods are made of chemicals that have complicated and difficult to pronounce names. So within this view, right, all of the other reasons why people might reasonably be concerned about food processing technologies or synthetic additives or the use of chemicals in food production disappear. So public concerns can only appear as misinformed, irrational, and anti-science. And this image and its viral uptake, 22 million views in the first year, et cetera, points to the prevalence of the real facts frame, both among experts and those working in the food industry and scientists working outside of the food industry as well. And its appeal to many members of the public. Kennedy went on to create hundreds more of these, sold all kinds of merchandise, mugs and t-shirts and stuff with these posters on them. And he wrote a book called Fighting Chemophobia, the story of how we became afraid of chemicals and what to do about it. So how and why do assumptions like this matter for food politics and for food policy? I want to dip briefly into one of my case studies so we can think about this together. And this is now taking us back to the work of the Alliance to Feed the Future. This is the organization that Schmidt had mentioned in that 2014 talk that I attended. This organization that was created to respond to negative perceptions of processed food. And when Schmidt introduced the organization that day in his talk, he described it specifically as a response to misinformation and falsehoods spread about the food industry by the film Food Inc. And what he called the $1 million curriculum being shared in schools right now to further communicate that information. So if you're not familiar with the Food Inc. film, it came out in 2019. There's a new version too that just came out. And it was described in its publicity materials as an unflattering look inside America's corporate controlled food industry, promising audiences you'll never look at dinner the same way again. One reviewer described it as doing for the grocery store what Jaws did for the beach. So it was a highly critical take, and it operated from a real food frame perspective and centered really on the idea that knowledge and information about where food comes from and how the food system works is essential to building a better and more democratic food system. The official synopsis of the film, for example, talks about lifting the veil on the food industry, and the lessons in explicitly explored people's right to know about what's in their food and how it's prepared and what it's doing. So it really paints a picture of an industry intentionally keeping people in the dark. And its aim is sort of to mobilize the agency of eaters to reshape the food system through their individual and collective agency. So the Food and Discussion Guide sets out to teach school children where their food comes from. And in response, so do the lessons that are put together by IFIC's Alliance to Feed the Future. These two sets of lessons were shaped by very different ways of thinking about food in the food system. And so they told starkly different stories of where food comes from. The Food Inc. lessons taught students that food comes from an interconnected matrix of social, economic, environmental systems, et cetera. And it really focused on tracing out these connections to reveal the hidden costs of food that appears cheap at checkout. In contrast to that, the Alliance to Feed the Future lessons taught students that food came from like this sort of simple linear process, as you can see on these farm to fork cards that students would have cut out and placed in the correct order. It's a linear process that starts at the farm and ends by delivering convenience, nutrition, and enjoyment to your plate. So very different stories that they're teaching about where food comes from. But what also became clear to me from looking at these side by side, these curriculums side by side, and thinking about them as engaged in a framing contest is that they were also preparing students to play very different roles in the food system and to think about their role in the food system very differently. So the Food Inc. discussion guide was for high school students and explicitly stated that its aims were to help these students think through their own perceptions, ideas, and solutions so they're better prepared to make thoughtful choices, to help them develop knowledge and skills to participate in meaningful public dialogue about food and the food system, and to take action to address food-related issues in their own lives. So everything about this curriculum, its design and its content reflected these goals of preparing students to participate in meaningful dialogue and exercise their agency. For example, it was based on the Socratic method, and every lesson was discussion oriented. There were deepening questions, and students were presented with opportunities to reflect and share their own opinions. The lessons all ended with ideas for action where students could take their learning out of the classroom. Like this, here's an example. This chapter called Hidden Costs explored what's traded off by focusing on cost and abundance in the food system. And the focus question for this chapter was, does it matter which food companies produce your food? So in this exercise, students were asked to place themselves on the spectrum between I'll buy what I like no matter what, or I'll buy from food companies only whose values I agree with. And then they would write about their position. This is an example of an activity that's about working together as a collective to make change in the food system. And it's asking students to reflect on and write about their skills and strengths that they bring to like a group. So all of these lessons from Food Inc. Reflect a particular set of assumptions about the role that they're preparing students to play, and a particular way of imagining the role of the public in the food system. They express what I think of as an intrinsically political imaginary of the public. The public is imagined as active, engaged, interested, willing and able to learn new things, acquire new skills in order to meaningfully participate in shaping the food system. So the Alliance to Feed the Future lessons not only told a different story of where food come from, but also prepared students to play a very different role. The focus was on celebrating the benefits of modern food production technologies, overcoming potential objections to them, and correcting misperceptions. And the teaching style was very didactic, a linear transfer of knowledge and information. The lessons were very much driven by food scientism and its assumptions. So they sought to correct and preempt the lack of knowledge and misperceptions presumed to be driving public concerns. And they were also rich in a particular kind of food scientism called attitudinal scientism, where communicators use images, concepts, practices, et cetera, associated with science to reinforce their authority and the primacy of science. So you can see here the mascot was this professor in a lab coat. Her name is Professor G. U. Eat Well. And the lessons were described as teaching students the science behind their food. And there was an entire set of lessons designed to meet national science education standards in the US. So for example, here's the kindergarten lesson. So these lessons were for K through eighth graders, kindergarten through eighth graders. And this lesson was structured as a science lesson, is designated as meeting one of these national science education standards, but the application section describes the aims for the lessons, and they're not exactly what we would think of as scientific. It says, here's the aims. With food processing, healthful choices are available in ready-to-go containers, single servings, and other convenient packages for busy families. This activity will introduce students to frozen, canned, dried, and fresh food as part of a fun and nutritious snack. So across the board, the lessons celebrated technology and attempted to overcome possible objections by highlighting its benefits. Like this lesson was for third through fifth graders. And the description says that at this learning center, students will understand how modern technology makes our food system safe, convenient, and accessible year-round. So the students had pages and pages of these innovation cards that you see here, and the activity was to sort them onto different plates, and the plates were labeled with improved safety, improves efficiency, or increases the amount of food produced, or makes food more convenient. So that was the lesson. So it clearly sought to prepare students to play a really different role in the food system than the Food Inc. lessons that we just saw. Rather than expressing a political imaginary of the public and preparing students to actively shape the food system, these lessons expressed and presented a purely commercial imaginary of the public and sought to prepare students to be passive, willing consumers within the food system. And I think there's a really important takeaway here. How experts communicate with the public about processed food and more generally about science and technology in the food system matters for food politics. And it matters not just because of its content or the information that it communicates. It matters because it is shaped by and it projects assumptions about the public, their skills, capacities, agency, their ideal relationship to science and technology, and the role that they can and should play in the food system. So the rest of the book explores these themes and arguments through three more case studies. These include an exploration of how these framing contests and their side effects, their anti-politics, play out in the marketing and regulatory arenas through debates about natural food and what natural should mean on food. It'll a look at what happens when industry communicators turn away from this established kind of facts first communication strategies and adopt new ways of building trust through transparency and shared values. Hint, I find lots of the assumptions of the real facts frame persist. And I end by looking at how transparency has become like a very popular, widely taken up strategy, especially for communicators around of and manufacturers and marketers of novel proteins, including both plant-based and cellular proteins. So I end by highlighting what I see as the urgent stakes for politics rather than anti-politics, particularly in this context. So strategy as a strategy for communicating about novel proteins, transparency tends to look like what you're seeing on the slide right now. It really just it tries to make these novel technologies feel and appear natural or closer to nature. You can see that in the ingredients of the impossible meat image here, where each ingredient, including its signature heme, is pictured next to its natural uh, source, I guess you could say, and as well as and it tries to make like complex technological processes feel familiar. And we see lots of cute, very simple process diagrams like the ones from these cellular companies on the other side of the slide. And those cartoonish images are from Impossible's video about how it manufactures its genetically modified ingredient heme, which is known to make their burgers look, taste, smell, and bleed like meat. Um, so this kind of communication looks different from earlier approaches to science communication that relied on facts and expertise, and it is different in a lot of ways, but in my view, this communication is still very much shaped by food scientism and driven by the assumption that public concerns about technology are rooted in a lack of scientific understanding or rational fears. And it continues to reflect this very commercial imaginary of the public seeking to overcome objections, possible objections, so the public can understand and accept these technologies and ultimately fulfill their role as passive consumers. So, in my view, this is really an anti politics of transparency. A politics of transparency would look really different, like a transparency that builds rather than forecloses possibilities for food politics to take place would include and address the bigger questions and concerns that drive um, public concerns about new technologies. And social science research has long shown that these concerns have to do with the purpose that technologies are designed and deployed to fulfill, the aims and trajectory of the food system as a whole, the power dynamics that shape all of the above. So a politics of transparency or transparency in the service of food politics would not only include, but also really center questions about knowledge and power and expertise. And particularly when it comes to novel foods and technologies aimed at addressing this confluence between climate crisis and the need to feed a growing population, the stakes for communication between experts and the public are high. The potential for robust and meaningful food politics at this critical inflection point in the food system hangs in the balance. So I wanted to end my remarks with a very brief recap of the four strategies that I think my work identifies and uses to contest and resist the anti-politics that the book tracks. So these are analytical strategies or ways of thinking that I hope you'll find useful. And I hope that some of you will make connections to ways of acting through food policy as well. So the first one, turn the gaze on expert understandings and misunderstandings of the public. So in the book, I call this the public understanding of science flip. And I hope to have shown some of what that can do in the talk so far. So also look not just at what is being communicated, but at the purpose of communication. This reveals the assumptions that communicators make about the public, skills, capacities, their role in the food system, et cetera. And so it's really important to look at that dimension of communication as well. Also, I think we need to keep an eye out for food scientism and the deficit understanding of the deficit model of the public understanding of science and how they work hand in hand. They are signs and symptoms of anti-politics. So I think it's important to be able to know them and name them so that we can resist them, resist their side effects of anti-politics. So finally, I also think it's really important to look past conflicts over the facts or what is right and wrong. So, for example, whether processed food is good for you or bad for you, you might have noticed, you might have come to this talk hoping I would answer that question, and I didn't. So, actually, I think it's really important to move beyond that question because most conflicts are not over the facts, they're over what should be done with them. And they reflect conflicting values and ideas about the aims and the purpose of the food system. So, in my view, we really have to get past conflicts over the facts to get to the big questions. And the big questions are really big ones like what kind of food system do we want? And also, how can we produce a culture and politics of communication that allows us to ask and answer that question through meaningful contestation or through food politics? So I'll leave you with those provocations, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Charlotte. Obviously, no disappointment here. This is kind of all and more that we wanted to hear about. And we have a few questions in the chat that also, fortunately, it's some things that I wanted to ask are in the chat. So that's great. And first of all, I'm going to kind of group two of them. One is from an anonymous attendee, and they want to know how is processed food defined in the book, because I think there's a lot of conflation of processing and then the ultra processing. That it will be my following question. But first things first, how is processed food defined in the book?
Yeah, so the question of how processed food is defined is a really important one in terms of thinking through the lens of this framing contest between real food and real facts, because centrally, these are different ways of seeing the same thing. And that means that they're operating around different understandings of what the term processed food means. And so rather than defining the term, the book is interested in how the term is used different ways in different contexts. And so my experience is that for folks in the food industry, food processing is it has a very technical definition, and their understanding of it has to do with um, technical processes that transform food from its natural state. And their view of how the public thinks about and uses the term of processed food is that it's nonsensical. It makes no sense because they're talking about something very different. They're not just defining, describing, or delineating this technical process or really um, operating from that technical perspective at all. And so oftentimes they'll refer to surveys where consumers are misidentifying processed foods or, have wrong-headed, nonsensical perceptions around this. But from so what I tried to do is also understand like where the real food frame is coming from and how it is thinking about this problem. And I would say that from a real food frame perspective, like I said, processed food is a troubled product of a troubled food system. And so it has become a vague signifier of of these convergence of concerns about the food system, and a way of expressing and talking about a whole set of interrelated problems and concerns about the food system and about industrial food. So it's used in a lot of different ways, and the friction and tension that happens when people are using it in different ways, misunderstanding each other, diagnosing each other's misunderstandings, is really actually where the action's at, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah. And oftentimes the processing in it comes with safety. If it's processed food, it kind of food safety from the consumer's perspective can be there, but now it can be further out into it's dangerous. But no, processed food is okay. It's ultra processing that might be conflicted. And the next question from Lewis, uh, just saying that great to hear you speaking today and reading your book as soon as it came out and helping him expand their perspectives. And his question is about, what do you think about how the conversation on processing and ultra processed food has developed since publishing the book? And if you think that the US federal state level regulatory developments support the real foods, real facts frame?
Oh man.
That's a long winded
Okay,
one. Yeah.
yeah, no, it's the big question. Lewis, I wish we could be having a conversation about this right now, but the format turns you into a bunch of words on a page and me into a talking head. But um, so this is a great question. I mean, I'll just start with where I was at when I finished the book, which is I find the ultra processed food designation to be a fascinating intervention into ways of knowing about good food. So that's fundamentally what I'm interested in, is contests over expertise. Who gets to define these things? What are the forms of knowledge that are taken to matter, right? And so what the folks who came up with the UPF designation did, with the NOVA classification, Carlos Montero and his colleagues, is they said, like, nutritional ways of thinking about good food don't work anymore. Clearly, we have a problem that this way of knowing isn't equipped to handle. We need a new way of measuring, knowing, talking about, identifying good food. And so their framework, the NOVA classification, includes a lot of things that nutrition never did, right? The level of processing, but also marketing, accessibility, ease of eating, all of these things that can't be known through a nutritional lens. And so I find that a fascinating challenge to the nutritional paradigm and to the way in which food industry experts in particular have relied on the nutritional paradigm as a form of sort of to bolster their own authority, and as a means of authority that has worked well for them, a way of defining the
Yeah.
conversation and what's reasonable. So it busts that whole thing open in a way that I find really interesting. Um, when I finished the book, it was barely a term well, I finished it a couple years ago, I guess. It was barely a term that the public recognized. It had been a little bit in the press in the US, but gosh, is that different now? And so I think the question is really about, like, how things have changed. I mean, first of all, as you know, it's become the expert contest over what this term should mean and how it should be used has become very public. And so we're now all watching this play out, different factions who are fighting to have the power and authority to designate, where the boundary around ultra processed food is, and how that's applied. And California just got ahead of everybody on this, I think.
Is the only one, right? In the US is the only one that has put something regarding ultra processed food. The rest are
Yeah. And so some people are framing that as like our governor preempting, the definition that might come out of the federal government. So it is now part of this much broader, it has been taken up as part of the Make America Healthy Again movement, which is a very powerful social movement. And I do think that understanding the history of the real food frame and where it came from in the early 21st century, how ideas of good food came to be coalesced around this idea of natural as opposed to processed, is a really helpful. It doesn't tell the story of, like, how Kennedy amassed a following, and it tells the background story of how how the public became primed to think about good food in this particular way. And I think it can help us understand that, but I think it's now become part of a bigger set of politics it's really hard to know how it's going to unfold. And was there a specific angle to the question about the contemporary that I'm forgetting?
I think it's good, well matched with another question from Nancy Karaman saying, like, speaking of another Kennedy, how do you see the real facts frame in the current intersection between food politics and the Make America Healthy Again movement? I think that's kind of follow on of what you're talking about. How does it fit into that national politics?
Yeah, I mean, I find all this very difficult to think about it. I do think about it, and I try to make sense of it. I did just read this week, I think, that the U.S. based, or maybe it's the global food industry, is trying to come up with its its own, suggestions for preempting or influencing uh regulatory RFK's regulatory strategy in the US. And this to me is very familiar. One of the things I did for the book was I read I analyzed over 7,000 comments that were submitted to the FDA in response to their request for public comments about whether and how the term natural should be regulated for processed food, for human food. And so some of the themes that I saw there, I think, are relevant, and there is a current comment period open for how to define ultra processed food, and I think some of the themes are going to be very similar. I mean, one of the things that's so striking to me is that the the language is so confusing because experts tend to mobilize the language of science, of facts and science and scientific authority for a lot of different causes and reasons, and in contexts where what is being debated. So for example, what process should mean, or what natural should mean, those aren't questions that science can answer. Science produces all kinds of information and knowledge that can inform a meaningful debate about that. But science doesn't, those are cultural questions. Those are questions about meaning and policy, that need to be addressed, robustly through lots of different forms of expertise. So I'm always wary of where experts are trying to close the discussion down to only scientific expertise, and or expand scientific expertise into the realms of meaning and policy, where it can and should play an informing role, and but I don't think it should be making making policy. So the last thing I want to say about that, this is my new what is it called, unpopular point of view. I think the term misinformation needs to go. I think
Right.
it's being banned, it's being used on all sides to refer to information that people don't agree with. It still has a lot of power, though. When people speak of misinformation, they're definitely, it basically like evoking the sense that the communicator is misinformed, irrational, irresponsible, ignorant, etc., lacking some kind of important knowledge. And it's being used in so many different directions in a way that prevents people from talking about what they actually disagree about. Because
Yeah.
misinformation is just a very vague way of saying, like, I don't agree with you
Yeah.
about this.
But it has become a tool of, it's been politicized, even the term, it's been politicized to say I don't agree, that is BS, just put it to the side, that I don't believe what you're saying. But also what you have on the slide about ask the experts. And I was an expert food engineer, hydrogenating oil, and I drank the Kool-Aid from IFIC, and being one of those that drank the Kool-Aid of we're feeding the world, but then kind of actually had to retrain in order to understand the public health side of things. So conciliating being an expert in one side of the spectrum versus being now kind of a public health so-called person that knows about public health now, how to conciliate those becomes a bit harder. And we have a question from an anonymous attendee saying, as trust in institution dwindles, and deregulation runs rampant, how can scientists and communicators actually educate and drive meaningful food policy? I think that's $1 million question, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it I think that experts who wish for their expertise to shape food policy and to be received by the public, another way of saying educate and drive food policy, um, have been frustrated, continue to be very frustrated with, what they see as the public's anti-science sentiment or misinformation, et cetera. And I think that this like growing, ongoing, maybe even rapidly increasing, tension and friction, misunderstanding between these two sides needs to be thought about as, rather than an objective, like I'm going to drive change by educating you, like a relationship,
Mhm.
more like a relationship. And relationships are dialogic. They're based on listening and understanding each other. And so I think there's a level of like listening and understanding that needs to happen on the expert side,
Yeah.
and treating the views of people of the public with a sense of interest and some respect, and also curiosity, and having some empathy for those points of view, and seeing and also allowing for the fact that dialogue means potentially ending up at solutions or changes that are different from the ones we as experts might have in mind going into the conversation.
Yeah. Fair enough. That's that's a way to approach it, and it's a directional relationship. We teach or share knowledge, but also we're taking it in. So how does that revolving door happen? And
It is alienating for the public to be presumed to be ignorant. That leads to
yeah,
greater alienation rather than solving the problem that was meant to be addressed in the first place.
which is what you were mentioning, right? Projecting assumptions about consumers in a linear format, and it's not necessarily the case. Complexity mirrors complexity, and I think we're getting to that level where people are asking more from all of us. So we have another question from Megan Arthur following the policy kind of theme. Again, very appreciative of the talk and the work, and asking if you're aware of similar framing analyses like scientism, but looking specifically at policy documents or a potential scope for this.
Sorry, I got distracted by a chat that I got about what are you all seeing right now? Do I need to change something?
Uh, um, how we just seeing a white your screen, the leafy, very nice leafy
Oh,
screen.
oh, I see. Okay, this is what I meant
Yeah,
to do. Sorry. I
there
meant
we
to make
go.
it so that
There we
you
go.
weren't
It's just
seeing a
you
screen at
in
all.
big now. It's just
That's
in
what I
big
was trying to
viewing.
do. Yeah, thanks for the
But
heads up.
no, the question was if you were aware of similar framing analyses, so like scientism, but looking specifically at policy documents, like doing that
Mm.
in-depth methodology, but doing policy analyses.
I am not aware of, well, I'm not aware of that. I think that if you know Lang and Heisman's Food Wars book, the Food Wars hypothesis, that to me it's about paradigms. It's about different food paradigms and their contest over who's gonna sort of direct the future as the um what are the two different paradigms? Technology and biology, something like that. Um, and one is more biotechnological and one is more ecological. And they look at policy more in that context. But so I would look there. It was very inspiring for me, that book. They're looking at paradigms. They don't call them frames, but they are.
Yeah.
And in my book, the chapter about that looks at the FDA's potential regulation of the term natural is also
Fighting.
kind of engaged with questions of policy.
I think it's chapter 3, the fighting natural. Yeah.
Fighting, yeah, yes.
Fighting natural. Yeah.
Fighting for natural, maybe.
Fighting for natural. Um,
Yeah.
right. Great. We have another question from Rachel Thompson. Thanks for this fascinating talk, and inquiring about what have been the impacts of your work exposing this framing battle, because I'm sure you're kind of letting the kind of worms spread out. If you've had any,
I honestly, I've been very surprised by the amount of engagement I've gotten to have with food industry and food science colleagues around this. I would say that's the most surprising thing.
right?
Um, I've been, I mean, and I'm one of these people who writes to have the conversation. So all those years of work I put in was to arrive at this moment where I could be here talking to you all about policy and coming from a certain perspective. But also I was at the Institute for Food Technologists annual meeting this year on a panel that was called How to Combat Misinformation and Win Trust for the Food Industry or something like that, right? And so they also wanted my perspective in the context of exactly the type of communication that I was critiquing in the book. I was invited to be part of the conversation. So I've been really surprised by it was definitely a goal to be this translator and to make each side more legible to the other side. And some people have certainly, some of my colleagues in the food industry have explicitly told me that they think that it's too critical and that they're being villainized and they want their
Yeah.
colleagues to read the book, but they might not make it to the end because they feel villainized. And then on the humanities food studies side, some feel that it's not critical enough and, you know, has been too generous and accommodating of industry perspectives. And so I feel like I've
Wow.
succeeded um, because I
It's
just,
treading on the gray zone, right? It's being in the
yeah.
middle. Yeah.
What I
Yeah.
really wanted was to reach enough of a broad enough audience that people could be dissatisfied on either end, right? Like, and that's hard to do. So I feel really glad that I've at least reached a broad audience.
Yeah. And it's that thing of building the skin to be comfortable being uncomfortable, because you're
Oh
tossed
yeah.
around kind of that in the boundary,
There
and being in the
there's
boundary can
no
be,
yeah, there's no
yeah.
home base for me that's not difficult, that's not a little bit uncomfortable because my work is so interdisciplinary.
Yeah. And I think the following question from Anne Marie Mayer would be relevant to this, because she's asking about if you'd like to comment on the influence of scientific studies designed and or funded by the food industry, because it's where which
Yeah.
side are you playing, you know?
Yeah, no, this is really important, and this is back to the whole thing about like misinformation, right? So so much of what I, you know, got fascinated with and spent all those years studying was this hand-wringing concern around among food industry actors about the public's misperceptions, misunderstandings, et cetera. And the research is increasingly making it extremely clear on a very granular level the role that food industry actors have actively played and intentionally played in creating misinformation
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
confusion.
Or shaping a certain narrative with certain goal, isn't it? It's like the
Yeah.
goal is kind of, we just have different, and they're
Yes,
focused
and
on that. Yeah.
but part of that is and what I'm really thinking about here is there is the kind of recent work that's being done showing how real strategy that very much mirrors kind of big tobacco's playbook around
Yeah.
um creating scientific consensus through funding structures and also using various forms of power to foreclose alternative scientific points of view. And you know, this there's a new book about the soda industry, for example, doing this kind of manipulation of the informational environment.
Yeah.
And so I do think it's important to name that public misperceptions, misinformation, misunderstandings, et cetera, are A, in my opinion, not the reason why people are concerned about processed food and the food industry.
Yeah.
But B, they do exist, and nobody's saying that they don't. And C, they exist for a lot of reasons, but one of them is because of the actions of the food industry itself.
Yeah. 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 And from the food industry perspective, us as citizens to be a bit more critical of questioning some things, it's also a point to take into account, right? We're demanding more from government sphere. But coming back to the teaching and in the classroom. A question from Rebecca Bishop is, could you expand on the attitudinal teaching you mentioned? And also, where do these teaching cards fit into the teaching of food literacy in the US? So how are we
Uh,
teaching food really? You know?
well, yeah, I mean, I will say that I was never able to find any information as a researcher. I was not able to find anything about the reception. Like, I would love to know, what it was like in these classrooms, how the teachers used these resources. I'm reading the resources, not their reception. I don't know about reception. Um, so there was another part of there was a part about attitudinal scientism, um, which I can't quite remember what the question was, but attitudinal scientism is kind of not, it's just a term that refers to the way that science becomes like almost like a performance, or a reference for accruing authority and expertise. So in that example, I was showing how this whole set of lessons was geared towards next generation science standards, which is the US's most recent science education framework. But each one of the lessons was really geared towards making students comfortable and familiar with processed food so they could be good consumers. So um, that's an example of using a framework of science um, to give a lesson a kind of authority. And then is there another piece I'm missing? What's the piece?
Oh, the question disappeared. I cannot hold it in my head. I think that
Oh,
was, how, yeah, the cards and how teaching food literacy in the
oh
US and
yeah.
how that comes
Right,
across. Yeah.
right, right, right. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, there's the
Mm.
fooding discussion guide was used. I meet students every year in my classrooms who encountered it. My son is doing it right now in high
Wow.
school.
Oh, wow, that's so
Um,
interesting that,
I
oh
know,
boy.
I know. And I've never met somebody who said that they did interact with the Alliance to Feed the Future curriculum, but I would suspect that it was widely used, maybe piecemeal. I mean, these are lessons that are prepared, ready to go, easy to use, and the instructions for the teachers are scripts. They
Yeah.
say what to ask and what to answer. Unlike the fooding discussion guide, which was Socratic, here are the questions, here's how to support a dialogue. It was ask this question about moldy bread and then tell your students how great preservatives are. This is the dialogue you're meant to have. And so, but that makes life a lot easier for teachers. I would guess that many of them were used, maybe not the whole curriculum. And then but in my opinion, food literacy means, and it can mean a lot of different things. What I'm
Of
interested
course.
in helping my students, for example, understand, like, we've all long come to understand that it's important to know where your food comes from. This is, at least in California, this is kind of baseline.
Yeah.
Um, but I think it's also really important to know where ideas about good and bad food come from, right? So this is, to
Exactly.
me, what food literacy, the kind of food literacy that I'm especially invested in, is helping people ask questions about how communication about food is motivated, who it's coming from. My first and second book were both about this topic in very different ways. So I'm hoping that in this way, this work does contribute to greater food literacy in that sense.
Yeah, because I think that's one of those translatable skills. It's the process of inquiry and the critical lens towards where does this clothes come from. It's not just the food, it's kind of the mindset of being critical of where things come from and my impact on the world, which it seems to be
Yeah,
less. Well, it's been a bit divided, right? We have
yeah,
everything. Yeah. And I guess you're
and not,
alluding to the gray zone again. You're alluding to
yeah.
to the boundary.
Right. And also it's not it's important to be able to ask, like, where this thing comes from, where my sandwich came from, but also where did my ideas about good food come from?
Of course. Yeah.
And so that's the piece that I feel like has so often been missing, is that, we've inherited, internalized, and applied all these ideas about good and bad food. And I think we need to really tell the story of how that came to be the way it is.
Right. Right. We have another question from an anonymous attendee, and we're going to come back to the politics of transparency. We're bombarding you here, Charlotte. And this is about if you can say something about brands adopting certifications such as fair trade, and to see if they actually work towards the politics of transparency rather than an anti-politics of transparency. Kind of your thoughts about that, you know, certifications, how, to what angle do they play?
Yeah. Actually, some of my analysis of the paradoxes of transparency in the book draw on Suzanne Friedberg's work, and she does specifically look at certifications and fair trade certifications in particular, and what they reveal and what they conceal. And
Right.
so just on a very general level, what might be revealed is some factual information about the supply chain, but what she finds is often concealed are the power dynamics that are behind all of that, and the kind of relationships with producers. And I guess what I'm most interested in is including questions of power in politics, and marketing for transparency. Transparency for marketing rarely does that. Does transparency that is evoked for food system reform and other ways do that? Does it include questions of power and expertise, authority, who gets to shape and the questions that we ask, who gets to shape the research questions that end up ultimately in technologies that land in our grocery stores? um, I don't know if that's something that's being. I think that's a question that I would love to put back out there, is what does it look like for food system change agents to use transparency in a way that's really designed to enable politics to take place. And by that, I really do mean disagreement, because very often transparency is used to convince people of a certain thing that somebody wants to convince them of, to
Yeah.
overcome possible objections. But um, transparency has I think this the sort of underlying commitment, at least stated commitment, to enabling dialogue. And so I think it can be effective. And the chapter on transparency actually looks at how the potential that transparency has for transformation and change through dialogue, but how the assumptions of the real facts frame often, if shape it so that that's not what actually happens.
Yeah, I think this contention of what it reveals and what it conceals, because I'm showing you a label that I want you to see that says something, but I'm not saying what's on the other side of the same coin, right? So reveal, conceal, I think it's a good way to think about it.
Yeah, it's just fundamentally so paradoxical, because transparency promises to reveal but can't possibly. It's a very
Right,
edited frame.
right, right. And a final question, because I think I'm vested in this question by Janie Armstrong. Um, and ultra processed food is permeating in food cultures around the world, in the recent UNICEF report. And if you can speak a little bit about, or even your thoughts about how your work can resonate with the global South, or kind of in different contexts of countries that are going through a nutrition transition in a different stage of the UK, the US, Canada.
Mhm.
Um,
I mean, one of the fascinating things about this is that many of these countries in the global south are way ahead of the US in terms of regulating ultra processed food in the
yeah,
marketplace. And so I think that it's a fascinating question to me, of like how and why that takes place in places like Mexico or Brazil, for example. Um, all, and there's other examples as well. This is not, totally my area of expertise, but where we see things like front of package labeling, the black hexagons that say high in sugar, high in salt, too much fat, something like that, and they're really unattractive. And we're so far from having something like, oh, maybe we're not. I don't know what's happening with policy in the U.S.
I think
anymore.
we're a bit far from octagons in the UK.
Right. From the octagons.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that the there's one story to be told about the nutrition transition, in the sense of ultra processed food sort of infiltrating, and those markets becoming increasingly attractive, probably to manufacturers, as these negative perceptions of processed food in the US increased. Um, But there's also a really important story to be told about how people have mobilized and used public health as a toolkit for changing what the grocery store aisles look like and what the packages look like, and
Yeah.
really getting way out ahead of us. Oh, it's Susanna Ramirez who's just chatted. Her work is incredible on this, and everybody should read it.
There we go. There we go. That kind of wraps up the discussion really nicely. There we go. Susanna Ramirez, thank you so much for putting that in the chat, Susanna. All right, so we're getting closer to the mark of the end of this Food Thinkers. Really, really grateful, Charlotte, for your talk and your appetite to make this more of a discussion and a chat. As we said, the everything will be recorded and shared in our YouTube channel. And yeah, just thank you so much, everybody, for joining and contributing to the questions. Sorry, we didn't have time to respond to all of those, but hopefully the conversation will continue, Charlotte. I hope you'll have a lovely rest of day in the US and evening in the UK or wherever you are. All right. I think that's
Thank
all.
you. Thank you
Have a
so much for the
lovely
conversation.
night.
Thank you all for being here. I hope we can continue the conversation in some way.
Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Bye.